Hi and welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Okay, great. I can look at them here. I'm Cassie, and it's a bit of a unusual setup for a panel, right? That all my fellow panelists are virtual. I, of course, talk to colleagues and friends on screen and box all the time, but it's a whole different story that other people are watching me do that. Yes. So please bear with us, and I'm really glad that you could join us for this panel on how we measure public good and open source and beyond. So there were numerous sessions and really interesting talks on about where people were hinting at economic value of open source, like collaborative value, and many other values and metrics on open source. But then when it comes to contribution to peace, prosperity, and healthier people and planet, it's quite a hard thing to measure. So that's where some of the social impact metrics come in. And these are the frameworks that help us understand what is, or if something is moving a needle tiny bit on issues like poverty, like environmental protection, and global well-being. And one of the most well-known goals and metrics for that is the SDGs. So we heard from a session yesterday, OSPOs for Good, which I see Nicholas there. Nicholas was moderating. Omar did touch a little bit on what SDGs were. So that's Sustainable Development Goals. And those are 17 very ambitious global goals that's aimed at making world a better place. And it's aimed at very important issues like ending poverty, safeguarding the planet, and ensuring better future for all by 2030. And they're very ambitious by design. But measuring something so broad is not so straightforward, especially in open source context as well. So and then just to say that our panel, my wonderful colleagues and friends here, it grew out of a CHOSS SDG working group, which was set up as a follow-up to OSPOs for Good event in 2024, which we heard about from the panel yesterday. And this was all sort of an independent community effort. And then, in this panel, we brought together people from very diverse fields, from academia, education, the international development, scientific research and policy. So because it's not an easy thing to do, measuring social impact in open source, but in general. So we thought having diverse perspective in the room would be really important. So with that, we'll start with a very brief round of introduction of our friends up here. So I will perhaps start with Angela. Angela, would you like to quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Cassie. I am Angela Newell. I am the Executive Director of Innovation in the Chief Information Office, and I am the Director of the OSPO at the University of Texas at Austin.
Thank you, Angela. Next, could I ask John to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hello, I am Jonathan. I am a program manager at NumFocus for the Open Source Science Initiative, where we're building some tools to measure these things.
And after, could I ask Michael to go, please?
Yes, hello everyone, greetings, and thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to be here. Michael Downey, I am here in my personal capacity, although in my day job, I work for the United Nations Development Program and have been working at the intersection between free software and international development for close to 20 years.
And last but not least, David.
Hi, I'm David Lippert. I'm the director of the OSPO at George Washington University. Hello from Washington, D.C.
So with that, just to share that we have some questions prepared for the panel that I'll ask. And then towards the end, we have allocated quite ample amount of time for audience Q&A, which there I will also answer, switch the role and answer with the rest of my co-panelists. Yeah, so the very first question is on defining impact, because we all come from such diverse sectors, ranging from academia, open science, to international development. So very curious to know how impact is defined in this very different lines of work and expertise, and especially like how is the impact defined in open source in academia or open source in science and such. So could I first ask Angela to talk about that, please?
Absolutely. So in academia, we have two primary products that we produce. We have intellectual property that contributes to basic science, and we have students that go out and do really awesome things in the world. So the way that we look at ourselves and measure the intellectual capital side of what we produce, are we look at citations. Those are, acknowledgements and licenses for the things that we write, the intellectual property that we produce. And we look at patents. Those are the things that we produce that have a physical body. Those are the two primary methods. We look at intellectual property markers. The argument now is that we should look at open source software as part of one of these measures of our intellectual capital that we produce in the world. This is important because, as I said, our primary product is basic science on the intellectual side of the house, and understanding how open source software impacts that basic science and the basic productivity of our university helps us understand our impact in the world. The motto at the University of Texas is "What starts here changes the world." And we believe that the intellectual property and capital that we produce, including open source software, is part of that, as well as the little bodies that we send out into the world to carry that intellectual property forward. That's how we measure it here in academia.
Really interesting to hear the intellectual property and then sort of the secondary impacts from there, whether that's humans that carry that or the research that carries that. With that, adjacent but slightly different, could I ask David to share from your perspective, please?
Yeah, so I'm new to academia. I started just over a year ago. I'm actually a software engineer in the industry for a long time. So I defer to Angela as the academic expert and agree with everything she says. I feel like an alien in the room with researchers and academics sometimes. And I bring some weird industry terms like earned value management systems, EVMS, which is, it used to be applied to building bridges and infrastructure, but more recently, I think over the last 5 or 10 years, it started to be used to measure building software. And it's really powerful in governments so you can understand who's doing what, how much is it costing, how many resources are needed to build a feature and make it work. So I wonder about bringing some of those some of those engineering methods more into the scientific community to start measuring impact. One thing I'm really excited about is continuous open science and the idea that you bring this agile development ideas and experiment with, will they work with the scientific method? And instead of having a paper that's published and then that's the definition of success or impact for 20 years, you have these releases and it's just constantly updating over time. But yeah, this is really fun to talk about and think about. And I think we're just in the beginning of making some big systematic changes.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, David. Really interesting to hear how you are bringing software development concept, especially release into academic publishing. And then I want to go to Jonathan, who is really part of the work that's supporting, being a backbone of all this academic work in open science that we're doing.
Yeah, so the question is, how do we measure impact in open source? We're struggling. It's kind of a new field. So in academia, we might have indexes and impacts, H-index, impact factor, that sort of thing that David, I love you mentioned, we might be bringing some changes to systematically in the near future, which is fantastic. We don't necessarily have those systems already to change. So we're starting to try to build them. And groups like CHOSS are doing great work with this. build them through quantitative metrics largely. So we have things like stars, forks, contributes, average time to PRs. With the research software angle, we're starting to merge the academia impact that Angela was talking about with the open source aspect. Which software is being used in research that is impactful, whether that's through impact or whether that's through citation measurements or some other definition of impact. But really, we're just starting this work, so it's a great time to get involved. And there's this qualitative aspect of, in open source, I kind of know who's impactful in my project. His name is Jim. And I know what projects are impactful in what domains, NumPy, SciPy, PyTorch, that sort of thing. And that's going to be really, really hard to measure in some sort of algorithm. So lots of challenges.
Thank you, Jonathan, for sharing challenges so frankly. And I want to go to Michael, who is not short of challenges when it comes to measuring impact.
Thanks, Cassie. Yeah, I'm struck that I think everyone here has mentioned this idea that impact is often best thought of like when you drop a stone into water, you have these ripples that go out, from there, and so you have, the immediate impact of what a FOSS project might be doing, but it goes and it spreads beyond your immediate connections, and that's the way those of us who work in the international government space and work with governments at various levels often will think about this. So if you start with the sustainable development goals that Cassie mentioned, these 17 broad goals that kind of everyone can understand, and if you peel that onion back one layer, you'll see that there are 169 targets, which are specific measurable outcomes that country governments would want to try to meet by the year 2030. So we can very clearly measure that type of activity, right? They're very quantifiable, and we can understand how digital interventions like free software can help assist with that. But there are also some other interesting measurements as you think about those ripples. And that's adoption of certain behaviors or activities that indicate the growth and success of FOSS throughout the government space. For example, at the end of last year, the UN member states agreed on something called the Global Digital Compact, which among many other things related to technology, specifically called out the prioritization and value of free and open source software to help solve government's challenges around the world. So you can look to see at activities that governments take in furtherance of that. We can also look at just kind of the spread of FOSS generally, as well as this concept called digital public goods, which is a concept we created several years ago to look at not only free and open source software, but also open standards and knowledge and other systems that are aligned with those ideals that are very clearly designed to be in furtherance of the SDGs. So you look to see how those specific tools are adapted and grow over time. You can also look at things like the development and implementation of open source policy at the government level, and how much governments have put into that, how widely FOSS has been adopted within a government, so internal use, everything from LibreOffice to things like Nextcloud and other enterprise types of solutions. Then at a further level of maturity, you can look for things like establishment of an open source programs office that will help to further the coordination and strategic thinking around FOSS throughout a government. So again, very many ripples that are out there. I think our goal is to try to systematize this and to try to build it into a more comprehensive maturity model so we can clearly understand where any given government or country might be and where they want to head.
Thank you so much. Just want to take one step back and then zoom in on something that Jonathan said. So Jonathan, you mentioned that like the NumFocus is working on developing some of the metrics and you would like to measure impact better. And NumFocus supports like such many widely used open source scientific computing projects. So from your perspective, how do you measure, or how more accurately, how would you like to measure the real world impact of these tools?
So I briefly mentioned the use of this software in research, which I think is a really good direction to continue down, especially when it comes to SDGs, because some of this research can be directly tied to the advancement of the SDGs. So through 2 degrees, we get to what's helping advance these SDGs. So that's really the most straightforward approach that we're taking right now, is looking for research outputs. Currently, unfortunately, those static objects that come out of a 20-year process that cite software that has a DOI or mentions that software. We're running some initiatives that are trying to help identify what software is used in research through mentions or through other means. But the DOI is the most straightforward process. And then measure how impactful that research is. Some of these tools, there's other aspects to it, like how fundamental are they to a domain, or how fundamental are they to an entire supply chain of research? So things like NumPy are a great example of something that's used in almost every domain. And then you have things like AstroPy, which are more specific to one specific domain. So there's elements of cross-domain and specific domain as well. But again, a lot of exploration and experimenting going on right now. So if anyone's interested in this sort of thing, it is a very good time to get involved.
Thank you. And speaking of academic research and the difficulty of measuring that, I think it's a popular conception that academic research can often remain quite like siloed. And yeah, I want to ask David, which is the main work that one of the main work that he's supporting, what like mechanisms or collaborative models that could help foster projects into this collaboration and ultimately as a support for global challenges.
Thanks. First, I want to follow on with what Jonathan was saying. I was struck by the H-index, and I heard a talk from Dr. Chell Gentman from the NASA Open Source Office, and she mentioned how her H-index score is higher than Fernando Perez. And I'm not sure if you've read a paper from Chell Gentman. She's fantastic and has done great work. But Fernando Perez is the creator of Jupyter Notebooks. So clearly he has a huge scientific impact in our world. And the fact that we're measuring him as like a lower impact because he's not getting the papers. The focus on citations and papers is fascinating to me. I don't want to get beat up here in the scientific community, but so I'll stop there. Regarding the OSPOs as a mechanism for breaking down some of these silos, in just a year and a half, it's profound how much we've been able to amplify each other's work. I'm in a group called Curious, which has over 20 academic OSPOs. And the sharing that we're doing between UT Austin and Stanford and University of Wisconsin and University of Vermont and Trinity and Dublin, and wow, it's just incredible. So we're sharing surveys, we're sharing student awards processes, we're sharing project registries, we're sharing conference ideas, we're sharing so much stuff that makes me as like an individual lead of an OSPO so productive. I get to tell my boss, wow, look what I did today. And it's really just, making a call, and somebody had shared their GitHub repo, and I just kind of clone it, fork it, and then I tweak it for my institution, and it's so powerful. And then we open doors because we do all these external collaborations. So we meet every other week, but I've gotten connected to an open forum for AI where GW is now joined with UT Austin and Carnegie Mellon and Georgia Tech, and we're helping define trustworthiness in AI and helping to have research. Strange idea to have research helping define policies for AI instead of just following I don't know what. So it's really exciting. And then I think the thing I'm the most proud of is being a co-lead of the UN SDG working group, which is based out of Chaos. And I've met all of these great people here, and we have many more collaborators in Africa and all over the world. And just the fact that we're willing to tackle some of these big challenges and take them on, I don't know, it's fantastic. So everybody should have an OSPO. I love my job.
Well, you're sort of, like preaching to the converted here. Like, yeah. So we're running out of time. So very quick, going to OSPOs and scalability. So Michael, your work that spans more than 177 nation states, and wanted to ask how you would evaluate the scalability of open source projects so that their impact can be replicated in different contexts.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that if you're thinking about serving the entire world with FOSS, you've got to remember that one size will not fit all, right? You've got to balance both the interdependence that we all know of working in free software projects with the independence that you've heard about that people need to adjust things to solve their own unique problems that they have in front of them. The good news is, as soon as I sit down with someone in my work and we get beyond the idea that free software is just about something that's no cost, people really get excited about the four freedoms, right? And they get excited about the empowerment to take something and make it their own and collaborate with something that has already been done and to make it better. And so this is an exciting opportunity to scale that work up. And as the concept of digital sovereignty has taken off, especially here recently, more than ever, it's important that we can demonstrate that in the free and open source software community globally, we have spent now a few decades at perfecting this idea of what the UN Secretary General calls global digital cooperation. Right, this is really kind of the first big success of the free software world. And we can look to even the big tech giants that are maybe fierce competitors, but are still able to collaborate on key infrastructure projects and other things that they share in common with each other. So that's what we want to replicate now at a global scale. And in the international space, I mentioned a few years ago, there was this concept called digital public goods that was created. And it's really about helping individuals ultimately in government identify potential solutions, high impact software projects that have really a clear connection to help them progress on achieving those sustainable development goals. Because these DPGs, these digital public goods, have been kind of pre-identified, they're able to help those individuals and small government offices find the most successful collaborations, find the healthy communities that are already out there, and importantly, build communities of their counterparts in other governments to help learn from each other, as you've been hearing. That's really the key to moving faster and scaling faster with FOSS.
Thank you. And last but not least, want to have the final question go to Angela, who had worked very much on scientific and technological policies. So the question is really how could policymakers create like incentives to encourage open source projects for public good? And also, if you could very briefly mention what would be a good way for them to evaluate the efficacy of such solutions?
So I'm going to start by stating a basic assumption that my basic assumption that public policy is really the architecture for society. And if we think of public policy that way, the first thing that policymakers and public administrators can do is view open source software, open source AI as part of the infrastructure of society. And the policy then is the instrument for how you want that architecture to be constructed. And this is a really cool time to be doing it because we're having all these advancements in information technology that can really help us think about the next infrastructure that we want for governance. Huge opportunity. So the easiest, that would be the first thing. Keep it in mind, keep software and open source software and open AI as in your mind as part of the architecture of society. And the easiest way to do that quickly is to put open source software, open source AI in your procurement practices, and then in your production requirements. So as you're giving out money, one of the production requirements would be, what is the open source software that you're using or the open source AI that you are using in this project to achieve it. And then procurement, procurement policies are pretty well known. So those are two easy wins. How we understand the impact in public policy, we talk about the economic value. So we need to add open source software, open source AI into our econometric modeling. We need to talk about impact and value, and we need to talk about innovation impact. And there are pretty well-known measures for doing each of these things. But the idea is just that we incorporate it into what we're doing already, and we really view it as fundamental as part of the architecture of how you build a society.
Thank you, Angela. Just a personal anecdote was I've worked in humanitarian and international development setting, not sometimes overlapping digital, but not always. So it's always working to slightly move the needle of sustainable development goals, little bit by little bit, but it's always hard to know if this is actually doing. And as I got to meet more with the metrics folks, especially from the open source community, I was told that people would ask what are you measuring? What are you interested in? And then everything that I said was basically looks like you want to measure everything that's either impossible or hard to measure. So so that was why one of the reasons I joined the working group, to get to know more about different perspectives and how other people do it, and if anyone has been successful at doing that. So with that, I'll slightly switch the role, and I'll go into one of the panelists, sit, and actually take any questions from online or from here.
Amazing. I'll start the questions. So because I work in open source in sort of a private business, and that's been the background in which I've worked in open source, I'm really interested to hear from the panel, because you are all so much more involved in kind of public sector or public sector adjacent things. What are the differences in measures between sort of the public sector versus private sector, and what measures they would care about for open source?
Angela, would you like to start? And then I would like to hear from David on his personal observation, and then I'll go from Michael and John. So Angela, would you like to start?
So I think that's an interesting question, because I think in our chaos group we had a really interesting discussion this past week, where we kind of talked about how we would deal with an innovation index, and an innovation index being something that is really measuring intellectual capital and intellectual property. And me, being a social scientist, was like, oh, well, we're going to get out our social science models, and we're going to have some kind of statistical evaluation of something where something we care about is a variable, and we're going to talk about these variables, and we're going to talk about whether or not we're moving the public good, assuming we have a variable that measures that. And this was my approach, because that's the methodology in my field. Then in the room, we had people talking about how we were going to go this very technical route and look at connections in GitHub and movements in GitHub, and we were going to evaluate software processes and things like this. And it was really funny, because as we talked, all of a sudden in my brain, this pyramid started forming, and I'm just like, okay, this very technical thing happens down here, and then you sort of get these layers of activity, and then you have the social science outcomes. I can probably talk better about this layer up here than I can about this layer down here, but there are these experts in the room that I'm so lucky and fortunate and connected through OSPOS for Good and Chaos and Curious and things like that to work with. So I would say, in my field, we really do look at the social science aspect, but I am so lucky to be partnered with people who can talk about the technical aspect.
Yeah, David, would you like to go?
Sure. I'll be really brief. I would like to change the conversation. So instead of focusing on quarterly profits and return on investment, we're focusing on impact to communities. And I think you can do that with one simple sentence. And this applies to public companies, private companies, researchers, everybody, and just say, instead of what are you doing for the community, say, what are you doing with the community?
Yeah.
And just by changing that, I think we can change the impact and the perspective and maybe have a better impact for all. Rah.
Oh, that was a lovely answer. Thank you, David and Angela. We've got one from the room.
Michael, I really liked how you are focusing on the targets of the SDGs, but they are, even though they're very quantifiable, they're sometimes very high level, and the indicators might be how many countries are reporting. How are you thinking about tools that sort of like enables that kind of reporting, but doesn't do the reporting?
Yeah, thanks. That's an important question to consider. And now there are many different types of ways to measure progress toward the SDGs. There are some of the official mechanisms that are in place that governments have to report. But one of the reasons I'm so excited about this SDG working group within CHOSS is we can break that down into more, I would say, human accessible methods and tooling. And that's really what we're just getting started with, is going through and translating back into kind of human meaningful types of measurements. It's important that I think in order to build support for not only free software, but the specific projects that are moving these SDGs forward, it's important to take some of these abstract concepts that you see when you start reading some of those targets, right? All of these things like maternal mortality, although many of us can understand what that's about, it's a little bit removed from the idea that people should be able to be healthy and have well-being in their lives. And that's really the power of the SDGs, is to go back up to that highest level and find the things that motivate people, and then work with them to identify what are the specific projects out there that are moving those forward, and what are the specific activities and functionality that can be built out within the projects that help nudge those along. So while the targets are good to understand what countries need to accomplish, for those of us who are involved in free software, it often is more helpful understand what the targets are in the back of our minds, but then come back up to the SDGs themselves, because these are what's actually are kind of the human approachable ideas that we can more easily measure the project's engagement and opportunities to help improve quality of life.
Could I add to that? Yeah. So one of the initial, I think it's too soon to call it a framework, but the observation was that, like, when it comes to FOSS and SDGs, it's an impact. It's usually measured in the uptake of an open source project by what we would like perceive as a public goods organization, whether that's a nonprofit that like does certain work that contributes to SDGs, or it's intergovernmental organizations, or hopefully governments, although like I think that's very debatable, or a project itself contributes to some sort of public goods. So those were two ways that that we had initially looked at. That's how it's currently often measured when someone says that this open source project contributes to SDGs or contributes to some kind of public goods. But there's so much more projects that doesn't fall into that, but that we all know that definitely contributes to the global betterment, really.
So, question from the chat. How do you include the voices from those ultimately benefiting from the SDGs in the target? For example, frontline communities in the global south, climate resistance, defending their needs, contributions, and their experience positive impacts given open source science projects or shortcomings. How do their voices show up in measurable assessments? It's a bit of a heavy hitter, sorry.
But extremely important. Yeah, who would like to take this?
Cassie, maybe I'll say one thing that I think is an important factor in moving that forward. One of the promising things that I'm seeing is more and more countries, particularly in the global majority / global south, are starting to adopt the OSPO concept within their governments. But the good news is it's not just something that's internally facing for efficient government services, which is all very important. But in most cases, they're focused also on building an ecosystem of technology work, technology capacity. So building up skill sets, locally within a country, for example. But the reason that's important is that puts the actual work closer to the individuals who are being impacted by the software that's in use. And so the more we can do to push things out of the halls of government and into the real neighborhoods and homes where people are actually working, the better we can do. And so I think any type of open source free software work that's happening within a government needs to make some concerted effort to get out there and make those connections into the tech ecosystem, which is much easier in the FOSS world than it can be in a proprietary software arrangement. So we have a real opportunity there to maintain that closeness and to track and understand how the decisions that are made by government and the selections that are being made around technology choices and design are actually impacting people's real lives.
Thank you so much, and thank you to our panelists and our hosts. Please give them another round of applause.